The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the courthouse waiting area, casting harsh shadows across David Martinez's weathered face. He sat alone on the hard wooden bench, his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt a stark contrast to the expensive suits surrounding him. His calloused hands fidgeted with a manila folder containing documents that would change everything, though no one in that sterile hallway could have guessed their true contents. Across the room, his ex-wife Sarah threw back her head and laughed, the sound sharp and cutting through the morning quiet. She was draped in designer clothes that David knew he had never been able to afford for her, at least not openly. Her new boyfriend, Marcus, a real estate developer with perfectly styled hair, had his arm possessively around her shoulders while whispering something that made her giggle again. Next to them sat Victoria Chen, Sarah's divorce attorney, a woman whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by her $500 haircuts. She was scrolling through her phone with manicured nails, occasionally glancing at David with barely concealed disdain. Sarah's voice carried across the waiting area as she spoke to Victoria. "This is going to be easier than I thought. Look at him sitting there in those pathetic clothes. I doubt he's made more than minimum wage since I left him." Victoria looked up from her phone and studied David with calculating eyes. "From what you've told me about his employment history, we should be able to get this wrapped up quickly. Men like that rarely have anything worth fighting over." David kept his eyes down, focusing on his hands. These same hands had signed contracts worth millions, had shaken hands with Fortune 500 executives, had built an empire that Sarah had never even suspected existed. But today, in this courthouse, he was just another struggling single father trying to survive a bitter divorce. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years of marriage, he had lived modestly, driving an old pickup truck and working conventional jobs while quietly building his business empire through shell companies and careful investments. He had wanted to surprise Sarah when the time was right, to give her the life she had always dreamed of. Instead, she had chosen to find that life with someone else. Marcus leaned closer to Sarah, his voice carrying just enough for David to hear. "You sure picked a winner there, babe. Glad you came to your senses before you wasted any more time." Sarah's laughter filled the hallway again, and David felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but a deep sadness for what they had lost, for what she had thrown away without ever knowing its true value. David closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the beginning, to those early days when Sarah had actually seemed to love him for who he was rather than what he could provide. They had met at a community college where he was taking night classes while working construction during the day. She had been studying business administration, dreaming of corporate success that seemed impossibly distant from their shared apartment above a pizza shop. Back then, she had admired his work ethic, the way he would come home covered in dust and still sit down to study financial markets and investment strategies. She used to massage his shoulders while he read business journals, telling him she believed in his dreams even when they seemed unrealistic. The first business venture had been small, a partnership with a contractor who needed capital for equipment. David had scraped together $5,000 from his savings, money that should have gone toward their wedding fund. Sarah had been furious at first, accusing him of being reckless with their future. But when that investment returned $15,000 in 6 months, her anger had turned to cautious optimism. He had learned to be careful after that, to keep his business dealings separate from their home life. Sarah preferred the stability of his day job, the predictable paycheck that covered their modest rent and groceries. So David had worked construction by day and built his empire by night, using different names and shell companies to hide the growing wealth that he planned to reveal as a wedding gift. The construction company came first, then the real estate investments, followed by a small tech startup that exploded beyond his wildest expectations. Within 2 years of their marriage, David was worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, but he lived the same simple life, driving the same old truck, wearing the same work clothes. He had wanted to surprise her on their 5th anniversary, to walk her through the house he had secretly purchased in the hills, to show her the investment portfolios that would secure their children's futures. Instead, he had come home early from a job site to find her in their bed with Marcus, the smooth-talking developer who promised her everything David had been planning to give her all along. The bailiff's voice cut through David's memories like a blade. Martinez versus Martinez, courtroom 3 is now in session. Victoria Chen stood first, her stilettos clicking against the marble floor as she gathered her leather briefcase. She turned to Sarah with a confident smile. "Remember what we discussed. Let me do the talking, and this will be over before lunch." Sarah nodded, smoothing her silk blouse as she rose. She caught David's eye for just a moment, and he saw something flicker across her face. Was it regret? Guilt? But then Marcus placed his hand on the small of her back, and whatever emotion had been there vanished behind a mask of cold determination. David followed them into the courtroom, his worn boots silent against the polished floor. The space felt cavernous, with its high ceilings and imposing judge's bench. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the drama about to unfold. Judge Patricia Reeves entered through a side door, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her seat. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and glasses that seemed to see everything. David had researched her thoroughly. She had a reputation for fairness but little patience for games or deception. The Honorable Patricia Reeves called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We are here today for the dissolution of marriage between Sarah Elizabeth Martinez and David Miguel Martinez. Counselor Chen, you may proceed with your opening statement." Victoria Chen rose with theatrical precision, her voice carrying the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of a failed marriage where one party has consistently demonstrated financial irresponsibility and an inability to provide adequate support for his family. My client, Mrs. Martinez, has been forced to seek security elsewhere after years of economic instability." She gestured toward David with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Martinez has worked sporadically in construction and various manual labor positions, never maintaining steady employment or building any substantial assets. My client simply seeks a fair division of what few marital assets exist and reasonable support arrangements given Mr. Martinez's limited earning capacity." David sat perfectly still as the words washed over him, his hands folded in his lap. He had heard these accusations before, during the bitter arguments that had preceded their separation. Sarah had thrown his blue-collar work in his face, calling him lazy and unambitious, never knowing that those same calloused hands had signed contracts worth millions. Judge Reeves nodded politely and turned her attention to David. "Mr. Martinez, I understand you are representing yourself today. Would you like to make an opening statement?" David rose slowly, feeling every eye in the courtroom upon him. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't take much of the court's time. I believe the financial documents I've submitted will speak for themselves. I only ask that you review them carefully before making any determinations about my ability to provide for my family." Victoria Chen barely suppressed a snort of laughter. She leaned over to whisper something to Sarah, who covered her mouth to hide a smile. Behind them, Marcus shook his head in apparent disbelief at David's audacity. The judge made a note on her pad. "Very well. Mrs. Chen, please call your first witness." Sarah took the stand with practiced composure, her hand steady on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. Victoria Chen approached with the confidence of a predator closing in on wounded prey. "Tell the court about your husband's employment history during your marriage, Mrs. Martinez." Sarah's voice was clear and measured. David was constantly between jobs. He would work construction for a few months, then disappear for weeks at a time claiming he was pursuing business opportunities. "We lived paycheck to paycheck when there was a paycheck at all. I never knew if we would be able to pay rent or buy groceries." What about his spending habits? Completely irresponsible. He would take money from our joint account without telling me, sometimes hundreds of dollars at a time. When I asked where it went, he would give vague answers about investments or business expenses. I began to suspect he had a gambling problem or was hiding debts from me. David watched his ex-wife paint him as a failure and a liar, each word carefully chosen to destroy any credibility he might have had. The irony was almost overwhelming. Those mysterious withdrawals had been initial investments in companies that were now worth millions. Those weeks away from construction work had been spent in boardrooms and corporate offices, building the empire that could have given her everything she claimed to want. Victoria Chen continued her methodical destruction of David's character. Did your husband ever discuss his financial goals or plans for your future together? Sarah's laugh was bitter and theatrical. Goals? David lived in a fantasy world. He would talk about big business deals and investment opportunities, but we were eating ramen noodles for dinner. He promised me things would get better, that he was building something special, but I never saw any evidence of it. Just more bills and more excuses. From across the courtroom, Marcus nodded approvingly, his expensive watch catching the afternoon light. He reached over to squeeze Sarah's shoulder in a gesture of support that made David's stomach turn. This was the life she had chosen, the security she thought she needed. Victoria Chen sensed victory approaching. In your opinion, Mrs. Martinez, is your husband capable of providing meaningful financial support going forward? Absolutely not. David is a dreamer who refuses to face reality. He's nearly 40 years old and has nothing to show for it except calloused hands and empty promises. I can't build a future on his delusions of grandeur. The words hit David like physical blows. He thought about the oceanfront property in Malibu he had purchased under a corporate name, the tech startup that had just received a $50 million acquisition offer, the investment portfolio that generated more passive income in a month than most people earned in a year. All of it hidden, all of it worthless if Sarah couldn't see his worth as a human being beyond the dollar signs. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold from today? What time is it where you are? Sometimes we all feel underestimated by those who should know us best, don't we? Share your thoughts about being judged by appearances rather than truth. Judge Reeves maintained her professional composure, but David caught something in her expression as she glanced at the financial documents he had submitted. There was a slight furrow in her brow, a moment of confusion that suggested she was seeing something that didn't align with the testimony being presented. Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. You may step down. Sarah returned to her seat with the satisfied air of someone who had just delivered a knockout punch. Victoria Chen was practically glowing with confidence as she organized her papers, clearly expecting a swift and decisive victory. Judge Reeves adjusted her glasses and reached for the manila folder containing David's financial disclosures. Her movements were deliberate and careful as she opened the cover, her eyes scanning the first page with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to uncovering truth beneath layers of legal maneuvering. Mr. Martinez, the court would like to review your financial documentation at this time. Please approach the bench. David stood and walked forward, his boots making soft sounds against the courtroom floor. As he moved, he caught Sarah whispering to Marcus, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear fragments. This should be good. Probably borrowed money to make himself look better. Always living in that fantasy world. Victoria Chen leaned back in her chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had already won. She had seen desperate men try to inflate their assets before, usually with laughably obvious fabrications that judges could spot from across the room. In her experience, construction workers didn't suddenly develop sophisticated investment portfolios. The judge's voice was neutral but commanding. Mr. Martinez, I see here that you've listed several business entities and investment accounts. Can you explain the nature of these holdings? David's voice remained steady despite the weight of the moment. Yes, Your Honor. Over the past 6 years, I've been building a diversified portfolio of investments and business ventures. The primary entity is Martinez Holdings, which owns controlling interests in 3 companies, including a construction firm and a technology startup that develops logistics software. Behind him, David heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, followed by Victoria Chen's urgent whisper. This is ridiculous. He's clearly fabricated these documents. No one keeps that kind of wealth secret from their spouse. Judge Reeves continued reading, her expression becoming increasingly focused. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to shift, casting longer shadows across the courtroom as tension built with each turning page. David remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the moment when his carefully guarded truth would finally emerge. "Mr. Martinez, these documents indicate significant asset values. Are you prepared to verify these claims with supporting documentation?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have bank statements, corporate filings, and third-party valuations available for your review." The judge nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the papers before her. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Reeves turned to the next page, then the next, her reading pace deliberately slow as she absorbed the information. David could see her eyebrows rise almost imperceptibly as she encountered figures that clearly contradicted everything the court had heard in testimony. Her pen moved across her notepad, making calculations and notations that would soon reshape the entire proceeding. Victoria Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence beginning to crack around the edges. She had built her case on the assumption that David was exactly what he appeared to be, a struggling manual laborer with minimal assets and earning potential. The judge's prolonged examination of his documents was lasting far longer than it should have for someone with nothing to hide. Sarah leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of what was capturing the judge's attention so completely. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit David remembered from their early days together when she was anxious about test results or job interviews. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her arm, but his own expression had grown noticeably tense. The courtroom clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching like an eternity. David remained at the bench, his posture straight and patient, while behind him he could hear the rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats. The afternoon sunlight had moved across the windows, casting different shadows and highlighting the dust motes that continued their eternal dance through the air. Judge Reeves looked up from the documents, her gaze meeting David's directly. Her expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away, but David caught something in her eyes that might have been surprise, or perhaps professional curiosity about how such a significant discrepancy could exist between appearance and reality. "Mr. Martinez, I need to ask you directly. During your marriage, did you discuss these business ventures and assets with your wife?" David's answer was quiet but clear. "No, Your Honor. I had planned to reveal everything as a surprise on our 5th wedding anniversary. I wanted to be certain the businesses were stable and profitable before sharing the news. Unfortunately, our marriage ended before that anniversary arrived." Behind him, Sarah's gasp was audible throughout the courtroom. Victoria Chen's pen stopped moving across her legal pad, and Marcus's confident smile finally disappeared completely. The carefully constructed narrative about David's failures was beginning to crumble as the truth prepared to emerge in all its stunning clarity. Judge Reeves set down the first folder and reached for a second, thicker document. Her movements had become more deliberate, more focused, as if she were a detective uncovering clues to a mystery that had just taken an unexpected turn. The rustling of papers seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed courtroom atmosphere. "Mr. Martinez, I see here documentation for something called Apex Technology Solutions. Can you explain your involvement with this entity?" David's voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Apex is a logistics software company I founded 3 years ago. We develop supply chain management systems for Fortune 500 companies. Last month we received a $52 million acquisition offer from a major tech corporation." The sound that escaped from Sarah was somewhere between a choke and a sob. Victoria Chen's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness replaced by the dawning horror of a lawyer who realizes she has catastrophically misjudged her opponent. She frantically shuffled through her own papers as if looking for some evidence that could contradict what she was hearing. Marcus had gone completely rigid in his seat, his expensive suit suddenly seeming less impressive in the face of numbers that dwarfed his own real estate wealth. The man he had dismissed as a failure, the husband he had helped Sarah mock and abandon, was apparently worth more than Marcus could have imagined in his most ambitious dreams. Judge Reeves continued reading, her professional composure intact but her interest clearly piqued. "And this construction company, Martinez Construction LLC? That's my original business, Your Honor. We specialize in commercial development projects. Currently we have contracts worth approximately $18 million in various stages of completion. The company employs 47 people and has been profitable for 5 consecutive years. The judge made another note, then looked up at Victoria Chen. Counselor, did you review any of these documents during your preparation for this case? Victoria Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. No, Your Honor. Mr. Martinez did not disclose the existence of these assets during discovery, and my client was unaware of their existence. Judge Reeves turned back to David, her tone carrying a hint of curiosity. Mr. Martinez, why did you choose to keep these business interests private during your marriage? David glanced back at Sarah, whose face was now streaked with tears of shock and recognition. Because I wanted to build something worthy of the woman I loved before I asked her to share in it. Judge Reeves continued through the documents, her voice taking on an almost incredulous tone as she read the figures aloud. Mr. Martinez, according to these bank statements, your personal accounts show a combined balance of over $4 million. Your investment portfolio, managed through 3 separate brokerage firms, is valued at approximately $12 million. And this real estate holding company owns properties valued at $28 million. The numbers fell like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. Sarah had covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as the full magnitude of what she had thrown away became clear. The modest apartment above the pizza shop, the second-hand furniture, the careful budgeting she had resented so deeply, all of it had been by choice while David quietly built an empire worth nearly $50 million. Victoria Chen looked as if she might be physically sick. Her reputation as a sharp divorce attorney was built on thorough preparation and aggressive tactics, but she had been completely blindsided by the reality of David's wealth. She tried to speak, her voice cracking. Your Honor, I need to request a recess to review these documents and reconsider our position. Judge Reeves shook her head firmly. Counselor, you had the same opportunity as Mr. Martinez to present evidence during discovery. The court will proceed based on the documentation that has been properly submitted. Marcus had slumped back in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by the stunned realization that he had helped destroy a marriage to a man who was worth 20 times his own net worth. The expensive watch on his wrist, the designer clothes, the luxury car in the parking lot, all of it seemed suddenly cheap and insignificant. The judge looked directly at Sarah, who was still crying behind her hands. Mrs. Martinez, were you truly unaware of your husband's business success? Sarah's voice was muffled and broken. He never told me. He lived like we had nothing. I thought he was a failure. I thought Marcus could give me the security David never could. Judge Reeves returned her attention to the documents, flipping through pages of corporate filings, tax returns, and asset valuations. Mr. Martinez, the court calculates your total net worth at approximately $47 million. Is this figure accurate? David's simple answer would change everything. Yes, Your Honor, that assessment is correct. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and gasps of disbelief. Sarah's crying had intensified, her perfectly applied makeup now streaked down her cheeks as she realized she had abandoned a fortune beyond her wildest dreams for a relationship with a man whose net worth was a fraction of what her husband had secretly accumulated. Victoria Chen was frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to reach her law firm's senior partners to explain how she had stumbled into the most humiliating case of her career. The woman who had built her reputation on destroying husbands in divorce court had just discovered she was trying to take down a multimillionaire she had mistaken for a day laborer. Marcus sat in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed the reality that he had helped Sarah leave a man worth $47 million for his own modest real estate portfolio. Every condescending comment, every smug look, every moment of superiority he had felt over David now seemed like evidence of his own fundamental failure to understand what real success looked like. Judge Reeves removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that suggested she was taking time to process the extraordinary turn this case had taken. In 30 years on the bench, she had seen wealthy men try to hide assets, but she had never encountered someone who had hidden wealth this successfully while living in genuine modesty. What part of this story resonates most with you? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known your true worth? The pain of not being seen for who you really are runs deeper than any financial loss, doesn't it? The judge replaced her glasses and looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Martinez, given this new information about the marital assets, do you wish to reconsider your position regarding the division of property? Sarah could barely speak through her tears. I don't understand. We lived like we had nothing. Why would he hide this from me? We could have had everything. David turned to face his ex-wife for the first time since the proceedings began. His voice was gentle but firm. Sarah, we did have everything. We had each other, we had love, we had a future together. But you decided that wasn't enough without ever knowing what else was possible. The judge made several notes on her pad, then addressed both parties. Given the substantial discrepancy between the assumed marital assets and the actual financial picture, this court will need to completely recalculate the appropriate division of property and support obligations. Victoria Chen tried one last desperate gambit. Your Honor, my client had no knowledge of these hidden assets. Surely the court can't penalize her for her husband's deception. Judge Reeves looked up sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. Counselor, hiding assets during a divorce proceeding would indeed be grounds for concern. However, Mr. Martinez disclosed these assets voluntarily and completely in his financial statements. The failure to discover them during your preparation is not the court's responsibility to remedy. She turned her attention back to the documents, making careful calculations on her notepad. Based on the actual marital assets of approximately $47 million, and considering the standard equitable distribution principles, Mrs. Martinez would be entitled to a substantial settlement. However, the court must also consider the circumstances that led to the dissolution of this marriage. Sarah looked up through her tears, a flicker of hope crossing her face. She had thrown away her marriage, but perhaps she could still claim half of David's fortune. The irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom that she might walk away with more money than she had ever dreamed possible, despite her betrayal. David remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for the possibility that his hidden wealth might ultimately benefit the woman who had abandoned him for another man. The money had never been the point, it had been about building something meaningful to share with someone he loved. Judge Reeves continued her calculations, then looked up at both parties. Under normal circumstances, Mrs. Martinez would be entitled to half of the marital assets acquired during the marriage. However, the court must consider several factors. Mr. Martinez, when did you begin accumulating these business interests? Most of the significant growth occurred during our marriage, Your Honor. I started small before we married, but the major expansion happened in years 2 through 4 of our marriage. The judge nodded and made another note. Mrs. Martinez, the court must ask directly. When did your extramarital relationship with Mr. Thompson begin? Victoria Chen tried to object, but Sarah answered through her tears. About 8 months ago, Your Honor. Judge Reeves set down her pen and addressed the courtroom with the authority of someone about to render judgment. This court finds that while the marital assets are substantially larger than initially represented, the circumstances of adultery that led to this divorce proceeding cannot be ignored in determining equitable distribution. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. Mrs. Martinez, you will receive a settlement of $5 million and spousal support of $50,000 annually for 3 years. The remainder of the assets will remain with Mr. Martinez. Sarah's face crumpled as the full impact of the judgment hit her. $5 million was more money than she had ever imagined having, but it represented less than 12% of what she could have shared if she had simply trusted in the man she had married. The fortune she had unknowingly walked away from would have made her one of the wealthiest women in the state. Victoria Chen gathered her papers in defeat, her reputation in shambles. She had built her career on aggressive tactics and thorough preparation, but this case would follow her forever as the attorney who had completely misjudged her opponent and cost her client $42 million through sheer arrogance and assumptions. Marcus had already stood to leave, his face ashen as he realized he had helped destroy a marriage worth more than his entire real estate portfolio. The woman he had pursued as a trophy, believing he was rescuing her from poverty, had actually been married to one of the wealthiest men in the city. His own modest success suddenly seemed laughably small in comparison. Judge Reeves addressed David directly. "Mr. Martinez, this court commends you for your complete financial disclosure and your dignified conduct throughout these proceedings. The custody arrangement for your minor child will be joint, with primary residence remaining with you given your demonstrated ability to provide stability." David nodded quietly, accepting the judgment with the same grace he had shown throughout the ordeal. He had not fought for revenge or vindication, merely for fairness and the truth to be known. The money had always been secondary to the principle that his worth as a human being should not be measured by appearances alone. As the court session ended, David walked toward the exit, his worn boots clicking softly against the marble floor. Behind him, Sarah was still crying, Marcus was nowhere to be seen, and Victoria Chen was frantically making phone calls to damage control specialists. Outside the courthouse, David paused in the afternoon sunlight, breathing deeply for the first time in months. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter asking how the court hearing had gone. He smiled as he typed back that everything had worked out fairly, and that he would pick her up for dinner at their favorite restaurant. If this story of hidden worth and quiet dignity touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from around the world. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not through loudness or arrogance, but through patience, truth, and the quiet strength to let our actions speak louder than our words. Subscribe for more stories that remind us never to judge someone's worth by what meets the eye.